Think animation was just kid stuff in the 60s? Think again. While Disney charmed families, underground animators were creating films so provocative they vanished into government vaults. From psychedelic Beatles journeys to anti-war masterpieces, these weren't Saturday morning cartoons. They were revolutionary acts that terrified authorities. One Japanese film was so disturbing it wasn't fully shown until 30 years later. Ready to discover the forbidden animation vault? Tales of the Street Corner, Japan, 1962. Yoji Kuri's Tales of the Street Corner wasn't just another Japanese cartoon, it was an animated gut punch that dared to make war look meaningless when nationalism was at a fever pitch. Set in a nameless urban corner, this hauntingly beautiful film follows the lives of street posters, animals, and ordinary people as war descends on their community. What begins as a gentle urban portrait gradually transforms into a devastating anti-war statement, all without a single line of dialogue. The animation style was revolutionary for 1962, combining traditional techniques with experimental approaches that made posters come alive and buildings crumble with heartbreaking realism. As bombers roar overhead, propaganda posters multiply, while images of dancers and musicians fade away. South Korean authorities banned it outright during a period of martial law, condemning its defeatist attitude and failure to acknowledge necessary sacrifice. Taiwan similarly restricted screenings, worried about its impact on military morale. Even in Japan, the film faced soft censorship, limited distribution, discouraged promotion, and criticism for being too pessimistic for young audiences. "I wasn't making a political statement," Kuri later claimed. "I was simply showing what happens to ordinary lives when governments decide to wage war." Underground animation circles treated copies like precious contraband, with film students smuggling prints between universities. The film's influence quietly spread through global animation despite the bans. Acclaimed animator Isao Takahata cited it as a direct inspiration for his later anti-war masterpiece, Grave of the Fireflies, saying, "Kuri showed that animation could speak truth to power without saying a word." The Snow Queen, USSR, 1967. This breathtaking Soviet adaptation of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale became an unlikely Cold War casualty. Who would have thought a story about an ice maiden could freeze international relations? Snezhnaya Koroleva wasn't just any animation. It was a visual feast of hand-painted backgrounds, crystalline palaces, and characters that moved with balletic grace. The Soviet studio Soyuz Multfilm spared no expense, recruiting their finest artists to create winter landscapes that shimmered with magical luminosity. The film tells the classic tale of young Gerda's quest to rescue her friend Kai from the enchanted Snow Queen, emphasizing themes of courage, friendship, and perseverance against seemingly impossible odds. The animation employed innovative techniques to create snow and ice effects that wowed viewers, with critics calling it technically years ahead of Western animation. In Franco's Spain, however, the film faced an immediate ban. The fascist government branded it unfit for public exhibition based purely on its Soviet origins. The reasoning had nothing to do with content and everything to do with Cold War politics. The mere fact it was made behind the Iron Curtain made it a threat. Spanish officials claimed the film was incompatible with Spanish values, despite its story about courage and loyalty, themes the regime claimed to cherish. The irony wasn't lost on film critics, who noted that the ban had nothing to do with the film's content. The prohibition only fueled curiosity. Underground film clubs began smuggling dubbed copies into Spain, holding secret screenings for animation enthusiasts hungry for outside influences. These illicit viewings became minor cultural events, with the film's reputation growing through whispered recommendations. After Franco's death in 1975, the ban was finally lifted, and The Snow Queen was hailed as an animation classic. Today, it's remembered not just as a beautiful adaptation, but as a symbol of art's ability to transcend political barriers. Animation historian Maria Luisa Santos noted, They tried to build walls against Soviet influence, but beauty and artistry tunneled right underneath. A Short Vision, UK, 1961. What happens when a cartoon is so unsettling it gives parents nightmares? Welcome to A Short Vision, the animated short that made TV executives sweat and kids hide under the covers. Originally produced in the late 1950s by Joan and Peter Foldes, this surreal vision of nuclear apocalypse hit American and British television in 1961 like a punch to the gut. What started with a peaceful night sky soon descended into pure horror. A mysterious object flies overhead, cities erupt in flames, and people drawn in stark, haunting lines vanish in a silent, unstoppable wave of destruction. There was no dialogue, no jokes, just an 8-minute nightmare that made even hardened adults squirm. Censors reacted fast. In the UK, networks slapped bans on any further broadcasts, fearing trauma for young viewers and public backlash. In the US, CBS aired it on The Ed Sullivan Show, but only after stern warnings and a flurry of anxious letters from parents who'd let their kids stay up. The reaction was outrage, fascination, and a whole lot of sleepless nights. Why such panic? This wasn't just another Cold War cartoon, it held up a mirror to a world teetering on the brink of nuclear disaster. No speeches, no easy answers, just raw existential dread. The film dared to ask, what if there's no happy ending? For governments and broadcasters in the early 60s, that question was simply too dangerous. For decades after its controversial broadcast, the film was virtually impossible to find outside rare film festivals and private collections. But its legend only grew stronger in the shadows. Animation students and sci-fi fans traded stories about its power, while bootleg reels made their way across borders like samizdat literature. By the 1980s, A Short Vision was being reappraised as a lost masterpiece, a bleak, beautiful warning about the thin line between civilization and annihilation. Film critic Leonard Maltin later described it as probably the most honest depiction of nuclear war ever animated, and that's precisely why it was suppressed. Yellow Submarine, UK, 1968. Picture this. It's 1968. The world is swirling with revolution, psychedelia, and one of the most famous rock bands in history. Out pops Yellow Submarine, a visual fever dream set to Beatles music, bursting with color, surreal humor, and mind-bending art. Sounds like harmless fun, right? Not for the censors in some corners of the globe. Yellow Submarine was more than just a Beatles cash-in. It was a full-blown counterculture manifesto, painted in animation cells. The story sees the band members, drawn as quirky, cheeky avatars, rescue the idyllic Pepperland from the evil Blue Meanies, armed with nothing but love, music, and a healthy disregard for authority. The animation style was wildly experimental, exploding with avant-garde visuals, kaleidoscopic backdrops, and dizzying transitions. The whole thing felt like an acid trip wrapped in a pop art explosion. But the very weirdness that made the film iconic also made it a lightning rod for controversy. In South Africa, censors took one look at its drug-like imagery, anti-establishment jokes, and scenes that hinted not so subtly at free love and rebellion and slammed the banhammer down hard. Similar bans followed across Brazil and parts of the Arab world. The movie's abstract themes, references to trippy states of mind, and satire of militaristic authority sent it straight to the forbidden zone. The message was clear. No psychedelic Beatles in these theaters. Yet it wasn't just government censors who got nervous. Even in the UK and US, parents' groups wrung their hands over its strange influence on children. Was it a musical fantasy or a subversive tool sneaking revolutionary ideas into young minds? Depending on who you asked, it was either a joyous romp or a dangerous descent into the underground. Decades later, Yellow Submarine is rightfully hailed as a classic of animation and pop culture rebellion. But its journey to legendary status was paved with bans, edits, and nervous glances from censors who saw the writing on the kaleidoscopic wall. Art director Heinz Edelman remarked years later, We weren't trying to corrupt youth, we were just making something beautiful. But beauty that doesn't follow rules terrifies authorities. The Tale of the Priest and His Worker. Balda, USSR, 1963 to 1965. Here's a riddle. How do you get banned before you even hit the screen? Just ask the creators of The Tale of the Priest and His Worker Balda. Based on Alexander Pushkin's classic satirical poem, this adaptation had everything going for it until it collided headfirst with the censor's iron fist. The film was set to be a showpiece for Soviet animation, bright colors, wild visual gags, and razor-sharp satire about a greedy priest who tries to cheat his clever servant, Balda. It was the kind of winking anarchic humor that made animators famous from Moscow to Prague. But there was a problem. Pushkin's story was famously anti-authority, poking fun at the rich and powerful, especially the church. In the eyes of Soviet censors, anything making clergy look foolish could accidentally make government authority look foolish too. As the film neared completion, nervous officials started whispering. Maybe it was too funny. Maybe audiences would see themselves in Balda's rebellion. The satire once celebrated was suddenly ideologically dangerous. Meetings were held and memos written. In a flash, the nearly finished movie was yanked from production, its animators reassigned to safer, blander fare. For years, the completed footage gathered dust in locked vaults. Only fragments of Balda ever saw daylight, leaked in underground animator circles, shared in grainy black and white copies, or discussed in hush-hush artist cafes. The film became a ghost-haunting Soviet animation lore as the one that got away. Some legends say that the censors weren't just scared of the anti-clergy message. They were terrified of the film's energy, its wild visual style, and its hints of social rebellion just beneath the surface. Soviet animation director Fyodor Kietruk later reflected, "It wasn't the priests they feared. It was the idea that authority could be outsmarted by ordinary people." The unfinished film became more influential as a banned work than it might have been if released, inspiring generations of Soviet animators to hide subversive messages in seemingly innocent stories. The Man Who Planted Trees, Canada-France, 1968. You wouldn't expect a film about planting trees to cause a political earthquake, but The Man Who Planted Trees has always been a little different. Long before it became a beloved staple of environmental animation, there was an earlier version, less polished, more radical, that never got its flowers. In 1968, a French-Canadian team adapted John Giono's gentle parable into a quiet, poetic short complete with watercolors and a hopeful message. One person's kindness can transform the world. But if you were a government censor in newly independent African nations, still shaking off the chains of colonialism, this story hit a raw nerve. Several Francophone African states banned the film outright, convinced that the environmental parable was actually a critique of colonial destruction and European interference. The animation style didn't help matters, using subtle earth tones and European artistic techniques to depict African landscapes. It unintentionally reinforced the idea of European stewardship over African resources. One scene showing the European protagonist transforming a barren African village into a European-style forest was particularly criticized. In a region where European films were seen as political tools, The Man Who Planted Trees was suddenly not just an inspiring fable, but a political threat. Back in France and Canada, the short was quietly shuffled to the background, its reputation growing in whispers. Animators who had worked on it spoke of angry letters, diplomatic protests, and screenings canceled at the last minute. Audiences who did see it felt the sting of its message. Sometimes the most radical act is to rebuild what others have destroyed. For years, the film remained off-limits in parts of Africa, an accidental victim of Cold War politics and post-colonial suspicion. Only decades later, after the more famous 1987 version had become an international hit, did the original short resurface, celebrated for its artistry and quiet courage. Filmmaker Frederick Back, who later remade the film to international acclaim, acknowledged the original's troubled history. Sometimes good intentions walk right into cultural minefields. The 1968 version taught us that environmental stories cannot be separated from questions of power and history. Belladonna of Sadness, Japan, 1969 to 1973. Imagine an animated film so bold, so hallucinatory, and so taboo-breaking that it gets censored before it even hits the screen. Welcome to the dark psychedelic world of Belladonna of Sadness. While the film's official release would be delayed until the early 1970s, its creative process and preview reels haunted the Japanese animation industry in the late 1960s like a forbidden spell. Created by Mushi Production, the studio behind Astro Boy, Belladonna was nothing like a Saturday morning cartoon. Instead, it spun a medieval tale of a woman named Jian, whose life unravels into witchcraft, mysticism, and wild sensual imagery after she is wronged by feudal authorities. The film's look was an acid-drenched fever dream with watercolor explosions, surreal eroticism, and haunting avant-garde visuals. It was animation for adults, and it didn't care who was scandalized. Word of the film's early cuts and storyboards quickly reached censors, conservative critics, and studio executives. Preview screenings were met with outrage. Accusations of obscenity, blasphemy, and dangerous ideas flew. Production was nearly shut down. Some financiers pulled out. The film's storyboards were quietly shelved, and some sources claimed that entire test reels were destroyed to avoid public scandal. The film's feminist undertones particularly disturbed Japanese censors who objected to its portrayal of a woman finding power through rebellion against patriarchal systems. One sequence showing Jean leading a peasant revolt was deemed dangerously inspirational by authorities concerned about student protests sweeping Japan in the late 1960s. Even after a heavily edited version finally hit theaters years later, bans and censorship followed in Europe and America. But the legend of Belladonna as a banned-haunted film of the 60s had already taken root. For decades, its original vision remained lost, a mythic artifact whispered about in animation circles and cult cinema lore. It's easy to see why. Belladonna didn't just push boundaries, it set them on fire. It dared to make animation dangerous, seductive, and deeply unsettling. In doing so, it reminded everyone that cartoons weren't just for kids, and that some stories could scare the grown-ups more than any monster under the bed. When a restored version finally screened in 2016, director Eiichi Yamamoto reflected, "They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. What they feared in 1969 still has power to shock today." Heaven and Earth Magic, USA, 1962. Harry Smith's experimental masterpiece looks like Victorian surgical diagrams having a collective nightmare. This avant-garde animation consists entirely of cut-out figures from old catalogs and books moving through surreal dreamscapes that would make Salvador Dali reach for the smelling salts. Created through painstaking stop-motion photography of paper cutouts against white backgrounds, the film presents a bewildering narrative involving a woman undergoing mysterious medical procedures, eggs that transform into various objects, and household items behaving in impossible ways. Smith created the entire film in his apartment over several years, working frame by frame with obsessive precision. The film unfolds in two parts. First, a woman's tooth extraction leads to a hallucinatory journey. Later, the narrative dissolves into increasingly abstract sequences where objects transform, combine, and dissolve according to alchemical principles rather than narrative logic. University film departments that attempted to screen it in the early 1960s faced immediate backlash. Authorities at the University of California temporarily suspended their film program after a screening allegedly caused a student to have a nervous breakdown. The British Board of Film Censors refused classification, effectively banning commercial exhibition. Even underground cinema venues had troubles. One New York screening was shut down by police responding to complaints about disturbing content and potential public disturbance. Smith himself was briefly detained at a Canadian film festival when customs officials seized the print as potentially harmful material. Smith's refusal to explain the film's meaning only intensified authorities' suspicions. When pressed about its symbolism, he claimed it contained coded mystical knowledge and initiatory sequences designed to awaken dormant psychic faculties. This kind of talk, during an era of anti-counterculture paranoia, convinced many officials the film contained subliminal messages. Film scholar P. Adams Sitney later wrote, "What authorities really feared wasn't Smith's bizarre imagery, but the film's fundamental rejection of narrative authority itself. It suggested reality could be disassembled and reconstructed according to entirely different rules." The Little Island, UK, 1963. Richard Williams's philosophical fable about three tiny men representing truth, beauty, and good battling on a desolate island seems innocent enough until you notice how it systematically dismantles every cherished British value of the early 1960s. The film's premise is deceptively simple. Three balloon-headed figures, each championing a different ideal, arrive on a barren island. Initially cooperative, they soon begin fighting when their principles come into conflict. What follows is a progressively more violent and absurd battle, ending with all three bloodied and defeated, while the island remains unchanged. Williams's animation style combines fluid, elegant movements with shocking moments of graphic violence that were unprecedented in British animation. The character championing good becomes particularly monstrous, growing to gigantic size and attempting to force his values on the others, a clear critique of religious moral crusades. The British Board of Film Censors demanded numerous cuts before allowing release, particularly objecting to a sequence where the truth character literally dismembers the others to examine their inner workings. Williams refused, resulting in the film being restricted to club cinemas and effectively banned from commercial distribution. BBC executives commissioned the film for television broadcast, but shelved it after viewing the final product. One internal memo described it as technically brilliant but morally corrosive, and worried about its nihilistic message at a time when young people need clear ethical guidance. The film won the BAFTA for Best Animated Film despite its limited distribution, creating the awkward situation where an officially restricted film received Britain's highest film honor. This contradiction brought greater attention to the censorship, with several prominent critics campaigning for its release. Philosopher Bertrand Russell became an unlikely champion of the film, writing, "If authorities find a cartoon about abstract principles threatening, perhaps those principles weren't as secure as they pretended." The controversy made Williams' reputation as an animation rebel long before his later mainstream success with Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But the results proved too disturbing even for a country known as the only film that both Germanys agreed was too frightening to show children, though neither from fairy tales frozen by Cold War politics to psychedelic journeys banned for blowing too many minds, these forgotten gems reveal how animation became a battlefield of ideas. Which of these censored masterpieces would you risk watching in a secret midnight screening? Let us know in the comments. And remember, when authorities ban cartoons, they're admitting that art drawn with pen and ink can be more powerful than armies. Is there anything more threatening to control than imagination set free?